In 1812, Americans were stunned by the attack of a foreign enemy of superior force. This act of war precipitated a kind of 19th century arms race. The contest would lead to the construction of a series of super forts designed to stand guard over the nation's greatest cities and defend the homeland. The largest of these was Fort Delaware.
If you think about a stealth fighter that we have today that repels radar and so on, this is designed a lot that way too, because the angles of the walls are to deflect cannon from getting a straight one-on shot, so it bounces off and so on. It's just extremely subtle.
In the end, this massive stone structure would serve not as an obstacle to foreign invasion, but as a makeshift city for thousands of Confederate prisoners during the Civil War. Men like English-born Confederate Private James Franklin.
My heart sank within me when the ominous name of Fort Delaware was whispered among the men. I had heard so many fearful tales of this place, told by men who had been prisoners here, that my imagination had shaped it into something resembling the notorious Black Hole of Calcutta. Pea Patch, as our boys frequently call it, in allusion, I suppose, to its size, is an island of about a mile in circumference, situated on the Delaware River, about 44 miles nearly south of Philadelphia. The river at this point is about 5 miles wide. Opposite the eastern side of the island is the shore of New Jersey. On the west side is Delaware.
We have here a rare piece of history. It is something that's forged in war, but not really used for war. It's a town that evolves out of war. It's a very peculiar town, but it just goes to show the strength, in my mind, of the human character.
We hear so much about the Battle of Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh. These are the fireworks that attract people. But the real story of the American Civil War, diplomatically, politically, this is where you're going to learn the real story of the American Civil War.
Marched us into an old plowed field. Yankees came, but we wouldn't yield. Shot real bad, and now let's heal. Out on Pea Patch Island. Waterbound, and I can't get home. Waterbound, and I can't get home. Waterbound, and I can't get home. Out on Pea Patch Island.
The development of our early Seacoast Fortifications in America was very crucial to the commerce and trade that we needed to develop as a young nation. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, these cities were the lifeblood of the nation. If the nation was going to grow, they were going to grow through these port cities. Congress in 1794 authorized the construction of what we know today as our first system, Seacoast Fortifications. Those first forts built to protect the seaports of these major cities on the East Coast.
During the War of 1812, these forts performed very poorly because they were so close to the cities, like Fort Mifflin was just south of Philadelphia, and so on. And President Monroe was very unhappy about that, and so he appointed a commission to design new fortifications. And in the eternal optimism of the military, they decided they were going to design a permanent system of national defense. When looking for a building site, they wanted to control access up the river. So the strategic location is to control, have a line of fire going downstream, and to have a point of constriction where it's difficult for ships to get around.
The Delaware River was the direct conduit to Philadelphia. Some 40 miles south of the city, where the channel narrowed, was a small marshy island known as Pea Patch. It would serve as the location for the nation's greatest undertaking of military engineering of the time.
And so the dilemma is that we are sitting on this very soggy island in which the first fort that was built here literally sunk, and that this fort stands here only as testimony to a great foundation system. They started to plan it in 1836 and started to build it in 1846. And it would turn out to be by the time it was completed in 1859, the largest masonry fortress in the United States.
The original Fort Delaware had been so poorly constructed through engineering failing that the Army was bound and determined that they were not going to have that problem again. The insurance policy was John Sanders. Sanders had extreme experience. He was meticulously detailed and a brilliant engineer and had been identified very early in his career as such. His ability to plan, his ability to coordinate, and his ability to work in hostile environments was very well noted by the engineers department.
Major John Sanders.
The materials and state of the island that I now observe are less an inheritance than an infraction upon the future plans for Fort Delaware. There were almost 2,000 logs, which had been purchased for piling, lying in the ditches. Drawing these logs out, breaking up the decayed boats, and removing the accumulated rubbish from the face of the island is the first necessary work to be done.
One thing they do is put down thousands and thousands of pilings, but more importantly, there's something called a cribbage. And a cribbage is really kind of like a framework of timbers that sit under this fort, almost like a lattice work. And it was put down first, and so it sits there and it spreads the load rather than pushing it down. It spreads the load in two directions, and then it holds the fort up.
John Sanders.
Now that the foundation of this important work is completely prepared for the commencement of masonry, it can be pushed toward completion as rapidly as means rendered will permit.
Despite the fact that this really is his masterpiece, he would not survive to see it through. But the work that he did here survives and is in use all the way out to things like the Sears Tower and the harbor defenses of Corregidor.
Sanders had championed a military marvel. It had taken over a decade and $1.3 million to construct. Millions of bricks and thousands of tons of stone from quarries all over the East Coast were used to complete the defensive wonder. In January of 1861, as the Union drew closer to inevitable war, Fort Delaware held a small garrison of 20 soldiers. By the end of the year, hundreds were stationed there, and the first Confederate prisoners had arrived. The armament of the fortress continued in anticipation of a naval assault. By the time it was fully armed, Fort Delaware would house 156 heavy guns of 5 calibers, capable of launching a devastating assault on approaching ships as far as 3 miles downstream. They would never be fired in defense of the fort.
These are the most powerful weapons in the world at the time. But no sooner than they get these big guns in, technology has advanced even more. And so by the end of the Civil War, these great guns that we see at these Civil War forts, they're obsolete. The forts are obsolete. The military policies of the country are obsolete because technology is advancing so rapidly now.
Far removed from the battlefields and bloodshed, enlisted men like Private Alexander Hamilton would spend long days guarding captured Confederates while battling an unexpected enemy: boredom.
September 21st, 1862. At about 8 a.m., a large steamer ran into No. 3 Wharf and discharged a cargo of Johnny Rebs. I was detailed for guard duty for the first time, and I was about as awkward as I could be. Could scarcely come to shoulder arms, having never been on drill in my life. However, with a good supply of cigars and plenty of shade, I got through with it.
Union guards drilled endlessly, preparing for a Confederate assault that would never come, while prisoners wondered how long their confinement would endure. Uneasiness and ill health hampered all.
It is true that the Civil War soldier's greatest enemy was not the bullet. It was not the minie ball. It was not the artillery shell or the bayonet. It was the microbe. More men would die of disease than would die of battlefield wounds.
Private Alexander Hamilton.
October 5th, 1862. I went over to the hospital to watch over some of the boys who were sick. found Vance almost dead. Crumrine and Granny delirious. They had to be either tied down or held in bed. Young is equally wild, but not so strong and boisterous. McMyers, also wild. Many of the other boys sick, but not so bad as these. The disease is typhoid fever, probably induced by eating so much fruit and lying on the damp ground. At about 1 a.m., Vance died.
It was understood in many cases if people ate a very dirty food or drank very dirty water, that they were more prone to disease. But in many cases, they felt that the disease came from the air around them. Malaria, for example, which was a major killer during the Civil War, was indeed thought to be due to bad air.
Peapatch was host to a variety of illnesses, many resulting from poor sanitation. Drinking water stored in underground cisterns was constantly polluted with sewage from the adjoining moat. The resulting health problems were frequently epidemic.
There were rules for latrines, and latrines were to be built and dug at a certain distance away from camps, and in the prisons they were to be built at certain areas. In prisons like Fort Delaware, like Point Lookout, that were on and close to a water supply, usually the latrines were built out on a pier over the water supply, and then men would just go into the water, which of course then lapped up on the shore and filled in when the rains would come, would wash over the land, so there was probably an immense amount of filth.
Viral diseases wreaked havoc on the immune systems of many of the troops, whose isolated rural upbringings left them vulnerable to infection. Staff surgeons, like Major Washington Nugent, labored tirelessly to keep up with the relentless cycle of infectious disease that plagued Peapatch, without knowing the true cause of the illnesses. Dr. Washington Nugent.
My darling wife, I told you that there were 3,500 prisoners here. There are at present 660 ill, 156 cases of smallpox, and a case of almost every disease ever heard of.
The standard soldier of the Civil War never fought the war alone. He always had numerous organisms living in and on him. Most soldiers suffered from lice and had a major problem with fleas and ticks when they were out in the field, but in particular lice. They called them graybacks, and they had they even would have races so that they would time their lice, and they would sit around and pick the lice off of them. These lice, we now know, carry disease. Typhus fever is carried by and passed by the bite of a louse. So most likely they were contributing to the diseases, plus contributing to just the general unwell feeling of the men.
Confederate prisoner James Franklin.
Around the yards, by the sides of the barracks, inside the barracks, in the bunks, everywhere are to be seen groups of men busily engaged, searching the hems and seams of their garments for that loathsome little persecutor which annoyed the Egyptians so much. This remorseless war against the lice never ceases. This place completely swarms with them.
Health problems and general discomfort were compounded by crowded conditions as increasing numbers of prisoners streamed into Fort Delaware. As the conflict escalated to its peak, captured rebels arrived in droves.
Fort Delaware received in June of 1863 8,400 men that had been captured in and around Vicksburg, and then in July it received close to 8,000 men again from the battlefield at Gettysburg, so it very quickly became very overcrowded.
Private James Franklin.
Passing by numerous sentinels, we were at length ushered into an open yard where we were thoroughly examined. Blankets with U.S. marked on them, canteens of northern make, knives, watches, money, anything else that might attract the cupidity of the searcher were unceremoniously taken from us. This fleecing operation concluded, we were shown our quarters. I found that I enjoyed about 5 feet by 2 of hard plank, which was to be my sleeping apartment for lo, these many days.
Who would think that you're going to find on an island in the middle of the Delaware River a big pile of bricks with lots of cannons, but is also a town with 19,000 people in it that are all figuring out how to live together in a really unusual place to do it. Once they get here, the war is over, and they're just Americans again. They're not going to try to fight each other here. They're not going to try to promulgate this war here anymore. They're going to try to live.
Month by month, the population of Pea Patch grew, straining the fort's resources and requiring increasing numbers of services. During his confinement, Confederate prisoner and artist Max Neugus would meticulously record images of daily life in this unique community, including the fort mascot, Bill the Cat. Private Alexander Hamilton.
August 6th, 1863. The 5th Delaware left today for Wilmington, accompanied by our band. We are left with only 300 men to guard fully 10,000 Rebs. Some uneasiness is expressed by the more timid, lest the rebels break out and lick us.
As thousands of prisoners from different companies were forced into cramped conditions, and men became distraught with their seemingly endless confinement, tensions at times boiled over. There were occasional escapes and small altercations, but Hamilton's fear of mass insurrection would never materialize. A variety of cruel punishments for fighting, drunkenness, and other infractions were meted out to both sides. Detailed accounts of bucking and gagging, hanging by the thumbs, and other humiliations are described in many prison diaries.
When you came to Fort Delaware initially as a prisoner, your experience was going to be about 2 weeks. The biggest problem comes after General Grant wants to no longer exchange prisoners. So up to that point, you're not going to stay here very long, and you know that you're going to leave. So now more and more people are coming, and they're staying here longer and longer, and they have no idea when they're going to leave, and that becomes very stressful.
James Franklin.
My situation would be more bearable could I employ my mind with good books, but the great dearth of reading matter puts that out of my power. None but those who have experienced the trials and hardships of a prison life, shut up as we are in this close place, can imagine the intolerable ennui with which I am afflicted.
Prisoner ranks of enlisted men suffered the harshest living conditions, but Union Guards fared little better. Confined on less than 75 acres with no real hope of escape, they suffered the brutal heat of the summers and deadly cold of cruel winters. Disease and discomfort made life nearly unbearable, and there was little to distract the prisoners fully from their hardship and misfortune. Private Franklin.
I think I have discovered the cause of the extraordinary flavor which our soup has while at dinner yesterday. As I was fishing in my soup for stray beans, which are scarce and highly prized, I brought up a large, black substance which looked anything but dainty and which I passed around among my neighbors for examination. The unanimous verdict was an old, worn-out chew of tobacco.
Just to feed the prisoners alone, they marched 300 head of cattle a week into Delaware City, slaughtered them, and brought the cattle over here. 300 head a week. Okay, now that's just feeding the prisoners meat. The amount of flour that needed to be purchased, the amounts of vinegar and salts and all of the other necessary baking goods that had to come in here, which were huge quantities. And they came in from Philadelphia on ships, and they were stored here. They had to be stored here. We had to build more storage houses to house all of this stuff, to take care of everybody. You had to have 25 or 30 boatmen working every single day in all of the daylight hours to bring stuff back and forth.
Not all prisoners received the same treatment. Just as Union officers were afforded many luxuries not available to their men, so were some high-ranking prisoners treated with greater dignity and respect. One of the most remarkable was Confederate General Jeff Thompson. Dubbed the Missouri Swamp Fox for his daring and successful guerrilla tactics, Thompson, known as a ladies' man, expert gambler, and poet, arrived at Fort Delaware with almost celebrity status. General Jeff Thompson.
I now felt a little nervous, for, as I said before, I did not know whether I was simply to be retained as a prisoner of war or held on some other charge, and I had formed an unfavorable impression in regard to General Schaff, the commander at Fort Delaware, from the accounts given by the Gettysburg prisoners. But I was soon relieved, for he met me with soldierly frankness and told me that his orders were to treat me with all the favors compatible with my safety that he could, and that if I would give my parole not to attempt to escape, I should have my freedom of the island from reveille to retreat. Of course, I accepted his proposition and was placed in comfortable quarters within the fort and was allowed to select an orderly from among the Confederate prisoners.
Residents of Pea Patch were separated from the rest of the state by a mile-wide stretch of the Delaware River. But nothing could stop news of events at Fort Delaware from reaching the mainland. Suffice to say, life at the fort was the talk of the town in Delaware City, and well beyond. Citizens were acutely aware of and involved in life on the island.
Fort Delaware isn't just out on an island, a great big pile of bricks and cannons that's supposed to defend Philadelphia. It's an integral part of the entire Delaware political and societal scene. Politicians are imprisoned here. Politicians campaign here. And a lot of public opinion works to exert pressure on the administration and on the way that they do things here.
Jeff Thompson.
A few days after I reached Fort Delaware, one of the chaplains, an Episcopal minister, came to me to tell me that certain ladies of Newcastle desired to know if they could send me anything to add to my comfort. I told him that there was nothing that I needed so much as a pillow, for my neck was nearly broken and headsore using my coat. The next day, Mrs. Barnett Ingram sent me a nice feather pillow, and I acknowledged the receipt in the following manner. The storms may blow and lightnings flash, and angry dash the billow. I'll dream of home and loved ones there, and bless thee for this pillow. I need hardly remark that in a few days all our mess had pillows, and if it had not been contraband of war, I would have had a feather bed.
7 miles upstream in the town of Newcastle, a young woman named Julia Jefferson was moved to a mission of mercy by the tales of suffering at the fort. She would dedicate the next few years of her life bringing much-needed humanitarian aid to unfortunate prisoners on Pea Patch. Perhaps the fort's most unique citizen visitor, Jefferson became the only person allowed to come and go as she wished.
I think it was quite unusual that a young lady, especially of her age and with possible political inclinations, to be able to visit the island at pleasure, which was how her pass was worded. And I think it obviously had a lot to do with getting in good favor with the right people. Many people might have labeled her a copperhead, which was the term for Southern sympathizers. And obviously Delaware was really neutral, although most of Newcastle County really favored the Union. So what she was doing was not necessarily accepted by all.
Letters from grateful prisoners reveal the extent of Julia Jefferson's generosity and the great effect that her aid had on the men. Correspondence from Union officers thanking her for her compassion to the men of both armies would indicate that regardless of her family's alleged Southern sympathies, Jefferson's main motive seems to have been humanitarian, not political.
After reading the letters and studying her and searching in the archives for any additional information, I really believe that she just was motivated with the wish to help the prisoners and alleviate some of their suffering. You know, so much was said in the local papers about how they were suffering from scurvy, they didn't have enough clothing or blankets, and I really believe she just wanted to make their lot a little bit better.
The so-called border state of Delaware embodied the nation's split sentiment. Though the Jefferson family's loyalties were in question, there were others whose opinions left no such confusion. A Presbyterian minister, Reverend Isaac Handy, became one of the fort's most infamous political prisoners after referring to the flag as a symbol of oppression. Handy was retained on Pea Patch for more than a year and held daily sermons for the other prisoners there. Enraged by having to endure what he called an unjust imprisonment by a corrupt government, he authored a scathing picture of life at Fort Delaware. Published after the war, scholarly evidence disputes the accuracy of Handy's accounts of cruelty and abuse at the fort.
What really seemed to happen is both sides began to really blame each other and to accuse them of all sorts of atrocities to the prisoners. There really is no evidence of that. The best thing you can do is go on statistics, and the statistics show that the Confederate soldier was 2 times more likely to die in his own camp than he was in prison. However, the Union prisoner was 3 times more likely to die if he was in Confederate prison than he was in his own camps.
In what was now a well-established community on Pea Patch, men on both sides prayed for an end to the war. As the days and months dragged on, residents simply tried to persevere until the day that they could return home.
Wars always seem like they're going to last forever. It seems like that's the state that you're in, and you never know when it's going to end.
Private Alexander Hamilton.
January 1st, 1865. We hail this new year with pleasure. May thy sun set not till this cruel war is over. The storm in which the old year breathed its last has subsided, and its fresh face looks bright and sweet. And may all things take the bright appearance of this glad new year.
There's no glory at a prison camp. It's just the drudgery of being in the Army and serving the needs of warring nations. But with all of that, it became a vibrant little town. It grew its own culture. It had its own set of rules and regulations that it lived by. But here it is, a completely unique town.
The war would end in the spring of that year, and Hamilton would be free of what in essence had become a prison to him as surely as it had to his charges. Within a short time, the last prisoners left the island, and the garrison was mustered out. Eventually abandoned, the fort would languish in disuse for decades. Lumber from the barracks and other outbuildings were stripped for materials, and storms destroyed the remaining wooden structures. But the stone fortress itself, though never afforded a brave stand in battle, would prove to be indestructible nevertheless.
Yeah, this fort is amazingly well preserved. Now, partly by accident, because it never fired a shot, compare this fortification to its sister fort like Fort Sumter in Charleston that underwent great bombardment, or Pulaski and Savannah, or other forts that were actually engaged. And you have to remember that forts are not designed to last a long time. They're designed to survive the first battle.
New construction took place at Fort Delaware in 1896 as the nation's seacoast defense strategy was overhauled once again. The last soldiers were garrisoned on Pea Patch during World War II. A decade later, preservationists began working to maintain this historic structure. Today, their efforts continue for the benefit of generations to come. Once one of the nation's largest and most modern fortifications, Fort Delaware still stands as a testament to a bygone era and an important piece of the foundation of the United States of America.
Put us in a railroad car to Dixieland, it's our revore. Learned to swim, but not that far, out on Pea Patch Island. Waterbound and I can't get home. Waterbound and I can't get home. Waterbound and I can't get home, out on Pea Patch Island.